So welcome to this session, which forms part of Getting on Board's Trustee Learning Programme. My name's Fiona McCausland, and I'm Getting on Board's Communications Director. And today we are talking about responsible investment. And before I hand over to Christoph Borisevich and Ewan McGregor, sorry, not Ewan McGregor, Ewan McDonald from Rathbones, I'm just going to cover off a little bit of housekeeping. So we're recording this session, you'll notice. You will get access to the recording and the slides that are used following the session. And the recording is likely to be added to YouTube as well, so you'll be able to access it there. Closed captions are available. I can see that you've already enabled these. You need to enable them at your end. Please stay muted on the call unless you're asked to unmute, because it helps to make sure that everybody can hear who's talking clearly. And please feel free to introduce yourself in the chat and tell us why you've come today. And also please use the chat for any questions. We'll, if you put the questions into the chat, we'll be breaking to field some of those and answer them. So yeah, just keep mentioning. That would be fantastic. And finally, thank you very much to our sponsors. Both our speakers today are from Rathbones, and it's thanks to their support for the Trustee Learning Programme that enables us to keep the whole programme free to attend, which is really important to us for our mission to make trusteeship and trustee information freely available to as many people as possible. So without further ado, I'll hand over to Christoph and Ewan. Thank you.
Thank you, Fiona. Ewan and I are delighted to be here today to talk to you about responsible investment. It's one of the things which really excites us and excites many of our charity clients. And so I'm just going to share screen with our slides, and hopefully that is working for everyone. It is brilliant. So if we just start with a few introductions. So I'm Christoph Borisevich. I am a charity investment director with Rathbones. I've been looking after charity portfolios, focusing on specialist, ethical and sustainable ones for just over 20 years. And I'll quickly hand over to Ewan.
Thank you, Christoph. Hi, lovely to be on the call this afternoon. My name is Ewan McDonald. I'm based in Rathbones' Edinburgh office. I'm a director in our Scottish charities team, and I've been with Rathbones for just 10 years, just gone past.
Okay, so the aim for today, the sort of 5 things we said we'd try and cover as we cover this theme of responsible investment and investments aligned with your values, is to talk about what the current rules on ethical investment are, how to decide what's ethical for your organisation, how to balance maximum financial returns with your charity's work and values, an overview of the various options and the various approaches available, and lastly, and maybe more importantly, how to work with your investment manager to navigate these issues. So if we jump straight in with the first of those, it's maybe helpful just to step back and have a bit of backdrop and context around responsible investment and how it came about. Really, some of the first responsible investors were some of the religious organisations back in the 18th and 19th centuries, and you'd have things like Quaker organisations talking about slavery, the Methodist Church, which at the time had a big teetotal wing, talking about investing in alcohol and whether or not that was acceptable. And then as you drifted into this century, you started to get issues around apartheid, and we'll come on a bit more to apartheid, which was one of the foundational issues back in the 1970s and 80s, but then also some of the Vietnam War and investing in defense companies and whether that was appropriate for charities to do. And so that's some of the backdrop. And then we get to where the rules are. Because really, when all of that was taking place, there weren't that many rules and that much case law on ethical investment or responsible investment. And when we talk about that case law, there's really one very, very important document that we talk about. You'll often hear it referred to by investment managers, and that's CC 14. It's called Investing Charity Money, A Guide for Trustees. The CC stands for Charity Commission. And that's the really central Charity Commission guidance on everything to do with investment in charities. I should say at this stage that I'm very glad Ewan's here, because when I say guidance, that's the Charity Commission for England and Wales, and that's the guidance for English and Welsh charities. There is a separate charity regulator in Scotland and another one in Northern Ireland who have separate bits of guidance. And if there are questions around those, then I'm very grateful to hand them straight to Ewan, because he knows much, much more about the subject than I do. In terms of that guidance for England and Wales, there's two key cases which have come before the courts over the last few decades. The first one's often referred to as the Bishop of Oxford case, which was in 1992. The then Bishop of Oxford took a legal case to the courts about, and by the time it hit the courts, much of it was no longer relevant because it was about apartheid. And so by 92, obviously, we're into a post-apartheid era. But it was very much around whether the Church of England could exclude companies who had investments in South Africa in the 1980s, so that apartheid era, and whether that would be legal to do or not to do. And the ruling from the judges at the time was that there were situations in which it was legal to take non-financial things into consideration if you're in managing charity investments. And they were, if there was something about the investment which would have a conflict with the aim of the charity, if there was an impact on the reputation of the charity or on how donors or beneficiaries might perceive the charity, and then also if there was little risk of long-term financial detriment. So that set out some parameters where actually there was a confirmation that this was an appropriate thing for charities to do. And for about 30 years, that was the only really legal case that anyone talked about. And then a couple of years ago, the Butler-Sloss case came before the courts. This was a couple of charities who were wanting to have an investment policy which was very much based around the ideas of net zero and the Paris Accord, and wanting to get the court's confirmation that that was fine. So there was no one saying it wasn't fine, but they just wanted that real confirmation in law. And there was a long ruling from the courts, and it was very much confirming what was already there from the Bishop of Oxford in terms of those general principles, but then also providing some more guidance as to how to apply them. And it reminded trustees that the purpose of being a trustee was to further the purposes of the trust, to go back to the basics, but then also that trustees had to reasonably balance all the relevant factors, both financial and then also those issues around conflicts and around reputational issues, donors, beneficiaries. They had to exercise good judgment. They had to act honestly with due care and skill and responsibly. So all the things that you'd expect from charity law. And that if they did all those things, and one of the things that it reminded everyone to do was to detail the decisions you've made and why, then they'd fulfill their legal duties. And it also noted that not all trustees would get to the same conclusion. And it would be fine if different groups of people had slightly different conclusions presented with the same evidence. So a reminder of the framework that allows for that responsible investment approach and what underlies it. So it's been a bit dry so far, and hopefully it will get a bit more interesting as I hand over to Ewan.
Thank you, Christoph. No pressure. So I'm going to spend some time this afternoon discussing the two topics on the screen just now. So how to decide what is ethical for your organization importantly beyond the personal preferences of the trustees and the commonly avoided industries such as arms and tobacco, and in very close relation to that point, how to balance wanting to maximize the financial return of your charity's investments whilst also aligning to your charity's work and values. And really, it's a privilege for me to be discussing these topics with you this afternoon, because although I've not included them in a trustee training session in the past, we are having these discussions with clients on an increasingly regular basis. And I think we're learning a lot through that process and how to evolve ethical policies in line with our organization's mission and values. So hopefully we can bring these concepts to life with a few examples. But if we focus on the first topic for now, the traditional approach for charities looking to establish an ethical policy was just to apply a blanket restriction on commonly avoided sectors. So be that arms, tobacco, defense, fossil fuels, your sort of traditional sin sectors. And there's nothing inherently wrong with that approach. However, over time, as you know, trustees change, maybe even investment managers change, and blanket restrictions can often be called into question. You know, why were they established in the first place? Why were they there in the first place? What will happen if we remove them? What's the impact on the fund if we run without ethical considerations? Is a question that we were asked very recently by a client. And I've seen more than one example where restrictions, interestingly, other than tobacco, are removed completely from charity investment policy statements. And this is generally where the ethical investment policy was not linked to the values of the mission of the organization. So something that we're going to touch on today. But secondly, as trustees, we all have personal opinions, and it can be challenging not to impart these on the investment fund and the ethical policy. And really, I don't think there's anything wrong with trustees having personal preference on ethical considerations, but it is important that these form part of a discussion from the outset and help to form the ethical policy. It should not be a list of companies or sectors that individual doesn't like, but it can form part of a discussion. And this is often a very challenging exercise, as you might understand. A lot of trustees have their own individual opinions. But as investment managers, we spend a lot of time facilitating these discussions, and we've built a framework that enables a discussion, which I'll come to in a second. We can touch on that in a second. But certainly, if I was to get across a point from this first question, a more sophisticated approach is to align your organization values and mission with your ethical policy. But if you forgive me, I'll just go off on a slight tangent for a second, because I felt that this was a very important topic to introduce, but it didn't necessarily fit with the natural flow of the original question. And that is, do we need to modernize our thinking on ethical restrictions? Do we need to think more broadly about ethical considerations in what is a very rapidly changing world? With the rise of artificial intelligence, machine learning, automation, digitization, these are very exciting prospects for investors. And those of you that follow the stock market will know that these have driven markets higher over the last 12 months. But they are changing industries and the world at a pace that we've never experienced before. I think the most ridiculous example of this, I saw in the news this morning, that the most downloaded news app in the US has started to generate content using artificial intelligence and has just been making up news stories. So it's definitely something that we need to be mindful of when we're forming not only an investment strategy but an ethical policy. And if you'll indulge me, I'll just use an example here, because I think it highlights the issue very specifically. And if we pick on social media companies for a second, and maybe inject some of my own personal bias, which I'm trying not to do. Social media companies are highly profitable businesses with excellent share price performance, and they're generally branded as technology companies, and so they're not often considerations from an ethics standpoint. However, if you think about how these businesses work, they thrive on growing and increasing screen time. Ultimately, attention is capital for social media businesses, because increased attention ad screen time equals more advertising revenue. And how do you drive attention? Well, that the evidence shows that through creating division, rage, and a culture of comparison. And this impact, in my experience as a charity trustee and sort of observing the wider world, is felt mostly in young people, where social capital is derived through engagement on social media. And there are many studies that show that there's a direct correlation between social media use and the decreasing mental health in young people. And let's not forget, these social media algorithms, they're not regulated like traditional industries, tobacco, fossil fuels, etc. So it's a very specific example, but I think it does demonstrate that this is a modern issue, and it's something that a charity working with young people might want to consider. I'm not necessarily saying it should be a restriction, but it might be something that you consider in your discussions when you're building an ethical policy. And there are other examples of that as well, so sort of modern problems, if you like, forced labor in supply chains, the increase of buy now, pay later apps, which are targeted in the main at younger people, online gambling, etc. So there are the traditional sin sectors, but I think we also have to have an eye on what's happening in the present day and in the future as well when we're building an ethical policy. Could you please move on to the next slide, Christoph? Thank you. So this is the framework that I discussed in the first slide. And this is basically designed to shape your thinking when you're building an ethical policy. And I won't go through all of the questions here, but I'll maybe pick out some of the main ones. But the most important thing for me is the best place to start, because you already have that information. The best place to start is with your organization's own purpose and values. So if you're a charity operating in the environmental space, well, you maybe want to consider the impact of fossil fuels and the work that you do, or fossil fuel companies and the work that you do. If you're a charity in the health and well-being space, well, maybe you want to consider the impact of fast food and associated products on your beneficiaries and stakeholders. So it's a very easy place to start, I think, to begin aligning your ethical policy with the values and the purpose of your organization. And not all values are relevant for the investment portfolio, but elements can be introduced into your policy. For example, if your organization is focused on having a diverse workforce, then you may want your investee companies to demonstrate similar characteristics. And this is something that we're able to analyze now in modern investment management. One of the values of the charity that I volunteer for is a spirit of respect and compassion. And this could quite easily be reflected in how companies treat their employees and the environment that they engage with. So there are definitely links that we can make to values, purpose, and mission with your end ethical policy and investment portfolio. Stakeholder concerns, I think, is a real key one. Rightly or wrongly, stakeholder concerns are becoming more important, particularly for charities servicing younger people. We have quite a few higher educational institutions as clients, and many have active stakeholder communities that place demands on investment portfolio restrictions, specifically in the fossil fuel space. We can see that change that's happened in the last couple of years. And a well-structured ethical policy can often be used as a defense against more radical proposals from stakeholders. And investment, I always try and encourage investment manager engagement with stakeholders as well. I think it's really important that stakeholders of your organization understand what the investment manager is thinking and how they are applying the ethical policy to the investment portfolio. Reputational risks are definitely an important consideration. It's highly unlikely, but the last thing you want is a headline relating to a holding in your charity's investment portfolio. There have been examples of that in the past. It's never good press, obviously. More recently, we've had 2 freedom of information requests for educational institutions, both seeking to find out if any investments had links to the conflict in the Middle East and or the forced labor camps in China. Now, freedom of information requests are not applicable to all charities, obviously, but it is a good example of why an ethical policy being in place can shelter you from these potentially reputationally impacting situations. final two I would like to just touch on before we move on is should we divest or remain invested and try to influence change? And Christoph will touch on more detail on this in a second. But we can be active owners of the companies that we hold on your behalf. We use our vote. We try to influence change within a business if we're not comfortable with the direction of travel. So being an active shareholder is really important. And that's all about understanding your ethical, the ethical policy of our clients. And are we worried about how a company goes about its business? The answer to that is yes, we as the investment manager definitely should be worried about how a company goes about its business, because we do not want to be invested in a company that starts to conflict with our clients' ethical policy and beliefs. Can we move on to the next slide, please, Christoph? So the second question is balancing financial return. Financial return, profit is not a dirty word, as a client told me very recently. Financial return is clearly very important. For charities, the investment fund might only be the only major source of capital, or in the case of some organizations, it's the only pot of funding that doesn't have meaningful restrictions placed on it. And so generating a long-term sustainable return to preserve and increase the spending power of your fund should be and is our primary goal. However, we do need to be aware that ethical restrictions can, in certain very niche scenarios, impact returns in the short term, and short term is the key here. So every asset class, ethical or not, will have its day in the sun. Fossil fuel companies and defense companies had a very strong outperformance in 2022, led higher by various conflicts around the world and the invasion of Ukraine. If you're a charity that didn't invest in fossil fuels, then you need to understand that you don't have that exposure. Other examples would be like the first decade of the 21st century, there was a huge boom in commodities as China and other emerging markets expanded. Many charities do not want to invest in the mining sector. And currently, to my point earlier, technology companies are now leading the market higher. So what I'm trying to get across here is it's important from the outset that you fully understand, as a group of trustees, you fully understand why you have ethical restrictions in place and how they support the organization's values. There's always the temptation to drop an exclusion when a sector performs well. I can't tell you how many times we've had that discussion. And defense companies is the latest one that is sort of being discussed widely by our clients. But if your ethical policy has been discussed, it's been fully understood by the trustees and the stakeholders, and it is detailed in your investment policy statement, then any short-term underperformance due to restrictions is understood, and the temptation is less to make changes to the policy. Also, your investment manager should be able to provide an opinion on whether or not your ethical policy restricts overall returns in any way. And this should always be in the context of your investment portfolio's target return. So for example, if you are trying to achieve the rate of inflation plus 3%, it's a fairly standard annual return target. If you're trying to achieve that return, your investment manager should be looking at that in conjunction with your ethical policy, and they should be able to give an opinion as to whether or not that policy is too restrictive, and therefore the return expectation needs to be adjusted. This is all something that is very useful to do at the outset of an investment management relationship. And also you need to be aware of the fact that if you are an income generating charity, then you will need to source, and you have restrictions on your traditional income paying sectors, tobacco, fossil fuels, financial services, then you will need to seek alternative sources of income. And there are plenty of alternative sources of income, but it's just awareness of those slight impacts on short-term returns is crucial. Over the long term, it really matters less, and good businesses tend to outperform more consistently over the long term. But you need to be comfortable with potentially looking different in the short term. Can we have the next slide, please, Christoph? We've talked a lot about restrictions or exclusions, and I guess that's quite negative language. an investment management company should have a more sophisticated approach to responsible investment that does cater for exclusions, but also aims to assess companies through their environmental, their social, and their governance factors, how they integrate with the environment around them, how they treat their staff, how they treat their customers, how they do they take product health and safety seriously. All of these factors combined with voting and reporting form a responsible investment policy and process. And I think that is where, to my point in the title of this slide, you don't necessarily have to forego returns in the long term if you have a robust policy in place. But Christoph's going to dive into the detail here a little later on, so I won't go into any more detail on this slide. And there's a few factors here that we look at when we're analysing individual companies. Again, maybe a little bit too much detail, and I don't want to steal Christoph's thunder for later, but you can see there some of the things that we would really focus on when we're trying to invest in a good business, regardless of the sector. Can we have the final slide, please, Christoph? And how to identify greenwashing in a responsible investment process or an investment manager. You know, greenwashing is a fairly new term, but it's earned its place, I think, in the modern dictionary. Greenwashing is the phrase that we use to essentially pose the question: are you getting what you expect with your ethical policy? Is it being applied in the manner that you expect or were promised, or are you being offered in effect a false solution? So there's a few steps we can take here, but ultimately it's just looking and doing a few due diligence checks, and these are actually fairly simple to do. So the first one is checking the credentials of the investment manager. You know, there are two main principal codes to sign up to. The first one being the Principles for Responsible Investment, and the second one being the UK Stewardship Code. Both of those organisations carry out in-depth due diligence on each individual company, and so being accredited by those two organisations is a tick in the box. You want to understand how environmental, social, and governance factors are integrated into the analysis of an investment company and how they look at individual businesses that they're buying for clients. You would want to understand stewardship activities and how the company votes on behalf of you as an investor. And finally, can you access reports? Do you understand what the investment manager is doing? Is the engagement work being reported appropriately? Probably won't go into any more detail on greenwashing, but it might be a natural time to stop and take any questions if there are any.
Yeah, there are a couple of questions actually, and a comment. Jacqueline is based in Glasgow, and she says that please could you highlight when there may be a difference in the legislation used in Scotland to what the Charity Commission for England and Wales use. And then Andriana has asked that they've said that they notice you're mentioning companies. Are you referring to only investing in individual companies or funds as well?
I'll take Andrea's question first because that's the easy one.
I'm very relieved you are.
So I'm referring a lot to companies because the vast majority of our client portfolios would be invested in individual companies, and that's where we have a lot of control over an ethical policy. We do a lot of analysis on individual companies and how they engage with the world around them. And so Christoph, I'm sure you have a similar view, but as I say, the vast majority of our portfolios would be individual companies, but we would hold funds for specialist areas. Specialist areas maybe being thematics or emerging markets or areas where we don't have the expertise internally. And where we do invest in funds, I guess you have to be slightly accepting that you do give away some control to a third party. The way we try to limit that is our research team, as well as looking at the quality of the investment, the quality of the third party fund manager, their performance, how they're positioned, they will also look at how they integrate environmental, social, and governance factors into their investment process. So we're almost taking our process and seeing how it's replicated at the third-party fund management company. But as I say, that is mainly for specialist areas. Christoph, I don't know if you've got anything.
Yeah, and any funds should tell you what their exclusions are. And so if you're a charity with a particular focus, or you've got a particular set of exclusions, you should be able to see whether that fund mirrors your set of exclusions or not.
Okay, thank you.
And I'll definitely leave Scottish law to you.
Was it Jacqueline that had the question on sorry, I've got the...
Yeah, she had a question on just making just wanting to know when things are relevant in Scotland, if they may be different. And she also had a follow-up question to that, which may be relevant to how you answer this. But she says, we are very new to this and don't have an investment policy at the moment. So just setting out, how can we go about setting an investment return target? And there's one more question onto that.
So the answer on regulation is actually quite a simple one, in that Oscar, which is the Scottish charity regulator, don't have as strict sort of guidance or framework. There is a page on Oscar's website, which I'm happy to share after, which provides guidance on writing an ethical policy statement. And that's pretty much all Oscar have said on the subject. A lot of charity commission work tends to be reflected in Oscar with a mild delay. So the way we operate is sort of really focus on what's happening with CC14 and apply that to our clients in Scotland until we hear otherwise. But I think unlikely that we would hear anything different from Oscar on that. So it's a bit of a rambly answer, but it's basically exactly the same at the moment.
Okay, thank you. Una says, how important do you think it is to have some level of investment knowledge among your trustees? Should charities be relying solely on investment managers to provide understanding and advice? I think that's particularly useful for small to medium charities as well.
Shall I start and then hand over to you?
Yeah, sure.
There's a limited pool of investment professionals in the world, is I think one place to start. And when we look at our client bases, some of them do have someone with investment knowledge on the trustee body, but not all. And I think many of those who don't would love to have someone, but finding someone with the skills, the time, and the generosity to give those skills and time to your cause isn't always easy. And so, yes, I don't think you have to have someone with investment knowledge on your board. It's helpful if you do, especially if you're, say, a grant giving body where the majority of your income comes from your investment portfolio, but it's not necessary.
Yeah, and most investment management companies will be willing to run trustee training sessions with an individual board. And so if you feel like there's a knowledge gap, or indeed if you just wanted to sort of have a general investment discussion, then you would likely be able to arrange that with an investment manager. And there is loads of resource online now as well.
Yeah, I think
the opposite. Sorry, Fiona. The opposite to that is having too many investment managers on the board, and then you don't end up going anywhere.
Yeah, so a challenge. I was going to say that sessions like this are invaluable, and just so you know, the right questions to ask, I think, is coming to the board meetings armed with those, and those meetings with your professional guidance.
Okay, shall we carry on and have more questions at the end? So we're a little over halfway through. So the third part of what we're going to talk about today was the overview of the different ethical investment options that you can pursue. And really, there's 6 of them on this slide, but they fall into 3 categories. The first 2 are very much around good stewardship. And that's making sure that both you as trustees, but also the investment managers you appoint, are acting as good stewards of those investments. The second 2 are very much around exclusions, whether positive or negative. And the last two are about going a bit further. For those charities where it's appropriate to move into the worlds of sustainable or impact investment. We're not really going to talk about impact investment today. That would be a very different session where people are looking at very deep social or environmental investments and thinking about how they can really further their mission through their investments. So things with sometimes non-financial motives. So it's one end of the spectrum, but it's not what we're going to cover in today's session. So if we look at the first one, which is around engagement and voting, voting is exercising our rights as shareholders, or if for us as investment managers, as your appointed agents. And that's partly about making sure companies are well run, but then there are also resolutions around social or environmental issues. We've seen them repeatedly come up at oil and gas companies in recent years about their investment plans and net zero. And sometimes we'll be voting against management there to make sure that we think those companies are being run properly for the long-term interests of their stakeholders, rather than some of the more shorter-term interests. And other issues you sometimes get resolutions around might be the living wage, which comes up, and we also get them around modern slavery, where we've been very active as investment managers. The other side of this stewardship is engagement. And that's where shareholders or investment managers engage with company management, often about how a company is run, where there's concerns or particular issues or themes. And that engagement, there's often an escalation. It often starts very private and very informal. And then depending on success and where that path leads, it can end up quite public. And you sometimes see it in the press where people have been asking questions at AGMs. So when that happens and you see it in the press, it's sort of the tip of the iceberg that you're seeing, and there's an awful lot more going on behind the scenes, and that's something which investment managers should be reporting to their clients about, what they're doing behind the scenes in terms of engagement. The other side of that stewardship approach to responsible investment is some of what Ewan was talking about around ESG integration, making sure that we're not just as investment managers talking about the short-term financials. There's often environmental or social factors which influence investments and long-term prospects for companies, and making sure we integrate those. If you like, we do our homework really when we're evaluating proper investments. So that's the first part around stewardship. You then get to some of the more interesting things, which cause a bit more debate, around screening and exclusions. The easy part of it is about what a company does, and you get some classical examples of health charities avoiding companies investing in alcohol or tobacco, or often you get Catholic charities avoiding companies which have exposure to abortion or contraception. And there's a whole array of different things which charities either negatively screen for or sometimes positively screen for. So things like alcohol, tobacco, armaments, the classic sin sectors that Ewan talked about. But you do get some more interesting ones as well. Sometimes animal testing for animal charities, or positive focuses towards environmental companies or companies with good policies on how they treat their workforce. Now, often these are relatively easy to screen for. It's very easy to find the data on whether or not a company earns revenues from tobacco. But where you start to get things being a bit more interesting is when you start to talk about how a company behaves. Or sometimes we talk about it as best of sector or norms-based investment. And it might be around mining companies. As Ewan said, they're often controversial. And so companies which have best of sector practices around those environmental and social issues. in oil companies, often we've seen investors want to only invest in those companies which have business plans aligned with the Paris Agreement. So very much a norms-based approach. And that analysis can be much harder, but much more interesting to do. It's very easy to say that you don't want to invest in companies which damage the environment, or which breach human rights norms, or which have a good transition to net zero. But then there's a lot of hard work for us as investment managers to implement that, where we've got to look at a wide variety of sources, fines and incidents in countries where these companies operate. And some of that information might be very hard to come by. And also things like the policies and the practices of those companies. And then lastly, we get to sustainable investment, where we're talking about investing in those companies which meet the needs of the present, which sometimes people use the language of benefiting people and planet, or contributing to solutions to society's problems. And there's examples of that about renewable energy, or about companies which are involved in training. And so that's really going towards the greener end of the investment spectrum. And I thought I'd have an example, because sometimes an example can really help to illustrate these things. So I thought I'd use a really interesting, controversial company, Shell. And it's a really interesting company. I should point out as I use it that we don't have anything against Shell. I'm using it because it's interesting and well known, not for any other reason. But at different points in its history, there's been lots of different controversies around Shell. If you rolled back the decades, there were controversies about its involvement in apartheid, issues around human rights and pollution in Ogoniland in the Niger Delta, the proposed dumping at sea of the Brent Spar oil platform, and then these days, a lot around climate change, obviously, and the transition to a low-carbon future. And just last year, we had a voting controversy around Shell, where many investors followed the Church of England in voting against the re-election of the board of directors. So how would different investors using those different lenses think about Shell? So if you didn't have concerns around responsible investment, obviously the whole spectrum of the universe would be in for you, so Shell would not present a problem. If you were engaging in stewardship and ESG integration, then you'd obviously be engaged with Shell, probably around net zero, and you'd be looking at how it managed its future as you thought about it as a possible investment, but there'd be nothing in that which would stop you being invested. If you thought about negative exclusions, well, it depends what your negative exclusions were. If you excluded tobacco, there's nothing wrong with investing in an oil company. Obviously, if you had an exclusion around oil and gas, you wouldn't invest in Shell. Now, this is where it gets interesting. If you had a best of sector approach, there's a few scorecards at the top of that slide around things like MSCI ratings or Refinitiv ratings. So these are companies which analyze the ESG approach of companies, and Shell ends up as a best of sector company. So at that point, it would be in. But then if you went a bit further along the spectrum to being a sustainable company, and many sustainable investors are looking for something which aligns with net zero in terms of benefiting people and planet, for most sustainable investors, Shell these days wouldn't qualify for a portfolio, even though it's got that best of sector profile. So the last bit of what we're going to talk about was around how to work with your investment manager. And really, there's a bit more detail to come, but this boils down to two key things. One is to talk, and the second is to ask questions. And I think you've all started doing the second very well so far. And really, if you don't talk to your investment manager about these things, and you don't ask them lots of questions, then there's not going to be much progress. There might your investment manager might assume you're not interested if you never raise the subject. So it's always important to keep that communication flow. And that's really, this is a trustee training session, not just around responsible investment, but around all the other financial factors as well. The better the communication flow we have with our clients and our clients have with us, the better portfolios reflect our clients' needs, both financially and in terms of responsible investment. So there are a few specifics in there. So find out what your investment manager already does. They might do a lot more than you think they do, but they've never really talked to you about it because they weren't sure you were interested. So do ask them about what their policies are around things like stewardship, around ESG integration, around voting, around any exclusions they might apply across portfolios. If you have a policy, about how they implement your policy. It might be that what they already do meets your needs. It might not. There might be a need to go forwards. Ewan's already talked about that process of discernment, but what are the issues that are relevant to you? What are your values and purposes? How are you going to express that in your investment policy and your investment portfolio? And as I said at the beginning, discuss it with your investment manager. Ask questions. Feel free to ask them questions about individual holdings. We don't always like it when people ask too many questions, but really putting them on the spot will say an awful lot about your investment manager and how they're managing your portfolio, and they should be able to answer those questions or come back to you after meetings. And the last one is really going back to some of that work at the beginning that we mentioned around the legal framework. Make sure you detail your responsible investment approach. So some of those duties as a charity trustee is around not only considering these issues, thinking about conflicts, thinking about reputation, but then noting down why you've taken your decisions. So that when someone says, so why do you avoid investment in defence companies, you can say, well, we discussed it, and these are the reasons. And that's really one of the key factors in all of this. So there is, as ever, a disclaimer at the end of our presentation, because we are investment managers, and investment managers always have disclaimers. But at that point, hopefully we've run through those questions and given you some framework about responsible investment and how to think about it and those issues, and also some practical takeaways as to how to deal with your investment manager. So if we stop there and we hand back to Fiona for some more questions.
Thank you, Christoph and Ewan. That was really, really interesting, and there was lots of practical advice in there that I think will reassure a lot of people who are on this journey. There's another question from Andriana, which sort of follows on from the earlier one, that in addition to ESG considerations, do you look at impact monitoring and reporting, i.e. as a social impact investment?
Okay, so social impact is a really hard phrase to talk about because it can mean different things to different people. So I think so I'll try and be precise as I talk in terms of definitions. Within the CC14 guidance, there is a separate thing called social impact investment. And that's where you're talking about an investment which is really principally about the social outcomes, and secondarily, hopefully some financial outcomes as well. Sometimes people call it mixed motive investments. So we're not really covering those today. If you were going down that road, obviously, that social impact is the key consideration in making the investment. So you definitely want reporting on it. But it's not something which most mainstream investment managers offer. However, you do get some interesting social impacts out of a mainstream investment portfolio. It's not unusual to see a renewable energy investment in a mainstream portfolio. And I think most of ours will have some exposure to some kind of wind power or solar power somewhere in it. So we can do aspects of impact reporting. That's in terms of specifically where you and I work. And it's something which is being more widely adopted in the industry. You do see some people talking about tons of waste saved in their portfolio, or trees not cut down, which can be done. But I think you have to be aware when you see that kind of analysis that there's huge numbers of assumptions built into them, and the end number, while it looks precise, has a lot of caveats and riders, and probably shouldn't be relied on too heavily.
Do you think that style of reporting is bordering on greenwashing, Christoph, or is that maybe too aggressive a term to use?
Greenwashing is a heavy word to bandy round. I think you'd have to look at some of the assumptions behind it. I think with people who haven't built it well, it could be. Some people who've really done the homework behind it, the figures might stack up. But yeah, I think depending on how well the homework's been done, yes, it could do.
Okay, thank you. That sounds like there's another one to knowing the right questions to ask to be really useful in those situations.
And always ask the question. There really is no such thing as a stupid question.
I had a question that if you're a small charity and you're trying to change your portfolio or even trying to divest from certain investments, are there any additional considerations that that trustees should take? Think about.
If I've got my mute off, so I'll probably start. I think that it depends what you mean by small, might be one question. That once you get past a particular threshold, it can be difficult to get investment advice. And that's something which everyone in the industry is aware of, and people are trying to find solutions to. But the regulator does like us to be very thorough when we give advice to clients, and for very, very good reasons. But that does mean that giving advice is quite a time-consuming process, and time-consuming processes can be expensive processes. And that means that when you have quite small portfolios, so in the tens of thousands, there aren't always the economies of scale to get advice, sadly. So hopefully that's something which, as the years progress, will get better. But it's something I think as an industry we're aware of. I don't know, have you got more specific thoughts, Ewan?
Only on the sort of implementation of the investment of a relatively smaller pool of capital. Christoph is absolutely right. It's very challenging to get advice on that space. But there are now lots of different options of charity-specific unit trusts and pooled funds. And the providers of those investment funds will be very open about the restrictions that they put in those strategies and their own responsible investment process. So it does put a little bit of work back on the trustees or the investment committee. So what you could do is look at a selection of the pooled funds in the market and see if any of those restrictions or the processes fit or align with your charity's values. It won't be a perfect match, likely, but you could probably find something that got you 90% of the way there.
Brilliant, thank you. I've just got one question that might sort of have been broadly answered, but it was an early one, just we've got a couple more minutes. Because when you were talking about the aims of the charities, I think it was quite early on, it was reference to the Bishop of Oxford case and conflict with that. How closely do those aims need to align with the objects of your charity, or can they be broader to do with your mission that might be not quite so tightly tied to that?
Yes, so some charities' objects are really tightly written. There's a lot of charities out there whose objects is general charitable purposes. And I don't know if that's the case with any of the attendees today. So I think it's not just what's in your, if you like, your legal constitution and your trust deed about what your aims and your objects. It's also about the work that you're doing, your day-to-day activities. If you think that you're a charity who or a grant-giving foundation with general charitable purposes, but many of your grants are to organisations around addiction, then you might end up with really having quite a lot of concerns about things like alcohol, tobacco, or gambling, which are some of the real sources of addiction. And although there's nothing written into your trust deed about any of those subjects, in terms of your beneficiaries, your donors, your reputational risk, your activities, they're really key issues. So I think you need to, I think the language in some ways of the Butler Sloss case is very interesting, that you need to reflect on it and reasonably balance those issues. So yes, which isn't always the easiest thing. It's much easier to say, oh, you just need to look at this one line. It will be so much easier.
Yeah, absolutely. And thank you for that clarification. That is really useful. And thank you both. That was so insightful, so instructive. Thank you. That was just brilliant. I've put into the chat our evaluation. Please fill in our evaluation form. It really helps with our impact to do that, and some other links taking you to the other sessions that are in our free Trustee Learning Programme, and ask from us if you are able to make a donation. That's always very helpful to keep everything afloat and going. And just remains to say thank you very much once again to our speakers and to our participants. There are some really useful questions there that I think probably helped everybody else on the call. And finally, thank you very much to our sponsors, Rathbones, for making all of this possible.
Yeah.
Thank you.